Hello, everyone, and welcome to DoK Talks. Today, I'm joined by a wonderful person. His name is Joe Gardiner, and he is the technical director at Portworx. We're going to be taking a closer look at some of the things that came up in our 2022 research report. Before we do that, we'd like to get to know you a little bit better, Joe. Who are you, and how are you?
It's a very good question. Who am I? So, hi, Bart. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. As you said, my name is Joe. So, I work in Portworx, which is now part of Pure Storage. Actually, Portworx was acquired a couple of years ago by Pure Storage, and we kind of became what's called the cloud native business unit within Pure. So Pure, as you probably know, a big storage company, industry leading, being around for a long time, and so we're now the cool Kubernetes kids within Pure. And so I work in Europe. I'm based near London, and I look after the customer-facing technical team. So that means like enterprise architects, that kind of role, solutions architects, you might have heard them called as well. So any folks in that role across the region, and also we've got some specialist engineers as well who work with our customers.
All right, very good. Working with the cool kids. I'm excited in the sense that being customer facing means that we're not just going to talk about, the bells and whistles and all the fancy features, but things that are actually providing business value and that people are willing to pay for. So that being said, you took a look at the research report. What were some of the things that stood out for you?
Yeah, so I think not just in this survey, but in pretty much every survey that's coming out, CNCF, our own, maturity is a key theme. I think last year, the CNCF survey was summarized with something like Kubernetes is crossing the chasm or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely a theme that I'm hearing a lot of now. And not only from the surveys, but also from our customers, that they are now targeting Kubernetes-based platforms as their kind of key production environment going forwards. And I think naturally, if you look at larger organizations, the majority of their applications are going to be stateful and therefore be data services of some kind. And I think the report, your report, also shows that those workloads are now being run at scale in production on Kubernetes-based platforms. I thought that was very interesting. And also the theme around skills. I think we've been talking about a skills gap when it comes to Kubernetes knowledge for years. I definitely remember talking to customers way back when I was working at Docker about skill gaps and that being a big blocker to any kind of containerization or Kubernetes project. And again, that's something that I think it was the second biggest challenge maybe around getting data services onto Kubernetes. Ongoing theme. And I think that's probably one of the hardest areas to address, right? Because it just comes down to general maturity in the market. So there's really interesting themes.
Yeah, with that question about skills and talent, as someone who's in charge of a team of the cool kids in Portworx, how do you detect those skills? How do you sort of diagnose we're going to need this, and how can you kind of figure out if someone really can do the things that are necessary in order to provide that value for customers?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's a good question. I think not to kind of compound the issue, but I think in the roles that I manage, there's also an element of needing to be able to communicate clearly, to be a strong communicator. So really, if I look at my team, I'm looking for people who are very technical, credible engineers who also have a great background in cloud and DevOps and maybe automation, config management, and so on, and are great communicators. So if you can send anyone like that my way, these unicorn people, that would be great. But I think, there's not a crossover, right? My background was in DevOps. So I came from Chef, right, where I sort of learned my trade. And despite the fact that, we talk about the next wave of technology and Kubernetes being transformative, all of that is true. But there's so much crossover between the things we were talking about years ago in the early days of like Chef and Puppet and Ansible and all of those guys, and the roles in those organizations where, DevOps engineers are now being called SREs, who are now being called platform architects or whatever, right? It's the same kind of role. We're just kind of giving it a different name. So I think anyone who's kind of got that background, that understanding, has a lot to bring, not only to my team, but also the community at large, right? Because there's so much crossover in technology and approach to technology and concepts. and all those other buzzwords.
I think that's a good point. And as you mentioned, in terms of the role, this notion that DevOps is dead and that we're just talking about platform engineering. Anyway, whatever it happens to be, a conversation that often comes up in our community is if we talk about personas or roles. Are we talking about SRE folks? DBRE is a term, that's coming in somewhat in terms of database reliability engineers. We've had different talks about that in terms of, who are the stakeholders when we're talking about data on Kubernetes, when we're talking about these things that appeared in the research report. And one of those things in terms of a challenge as well as an opportunity, the operator pattern. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think the operator pattern is that kind of natural evolution away from the pain of managing loads of lines of YAML, and then we saw packaging with Helm, of course, which made things a little bit simpler, but that doesn't solve the lifecycle piece, and that's where the operator pattern comes in, right? It's that kind of curated experience around the full lifecycle of the application. So conceptually, hugely powerful, right? And there is somewhat of a standard around that, and we've seen Red Hat with their framework push that, and that's been very helpful, I think, for vendors to have some kind of consistency and for customers to feel confident in using operators. But what I'm seeing a lot of, and this probably relates back to what we were talking about around skills, is that we're almost creating a new layer of abstraction where there's less of an understanding of actually what's happening behind the scenes, which is good and bad. But it also means that you're now managing complexity, but higher up the stack. So it feels like in the early days of operators, it was going to be a kind of silver bullet for running more complex workloads in Kubernetes. That's not actually what I'm seeing in reality. The kind of conversations we're having is that the challenge of saying to a DBA team, okay, we want you to take your skills, your knowledge in architecting production data services, databases, whatever it happens to be, and now manage it through this abstraction of an operator. I mean, that's huge. And then, of course, if we look at some of the biggest Kubernetes in the world, like, Kubernetes users in the world, like global banks, manufacturing, huge enterprises where this stuff is super critical. It's not just about the complexity of the technology and transferring skills. It's also about scale. And I know that scale is kind of we talk about scale and a lot of people say, oh, you don't really have a scale problem. But these kind of businesses, they do, right? They're running, 50,000 pods and thousands of nodes, and just massive platforms. And to try and get the knowledge from a DBA via the abstraction of an operator into a platform of that scale to make it production suitable is huge. And that's one application. How many data services do you think a global bank is running? I mean, they could have 30, 40 different flavor of application. And now suddenly you have to manage all of those through this operator abstraction. I just think it's a massive ask, right? And some of the things that I'm sort of picking up on is that there's this almost like tug of war between wanting to keep that abstraction away from the infrastructure and potentially a cloud provider, and you accept the complexity of doing that yourself, or you say, actually, this is too much and we're going to go and use a managed service from a cloud provider, like an Amazon Azure, RDS, whatever, right? That has its own issues around lock-in and compliance, and a lot of banks can't use those services. So you've got this really difficult kind of situation that I think is coming to a head. You've got all this complexity, all of this scale, all of these production requirements that are taken away if you just go and pay for a service. But in most cases, you can't actually do that. So you've got organizations saying, well, we want that, but we want it on-prem and we don't want to compromise. So how do we do it? And honestly, for me, a DBA team with all of their skills aren't the right people to take responsibility for that. How do you really want a DBA team to go off and build a managed database service like an Atlas or something like that for your own cloud and then manage it? No, that's not what their skills are in, right? And so I don't know what the answer is, but I'm definitely seeing these kind of converging challenges, which I think is going to, not so much in the early days of running data services on Kubernetes, but when we see those more mature organizations who are further along that journey, I think there are going to be new pain points that are going to emerge because of some of the things I've just been talking about.
interesting to see the mixture of both the technical challenge as well as the organizational challenge of who are these stakeholders and how is this going to play out. In addition, the build buy dilemma. And the other thing that seen here in what you mentioned previously, talking about maturity, we're talking about maturity in the operator space. A frequent comment that we hear is that operators at first glance might be nice, but perhaps the reach or their ability to be flexible might be somewhat limited. The amount of time that's going to be taken by a DBA team or other folks from inside the organization to build it, is that really cost effective? Is it really going to solve your problems? These are some of the lingering challenges that I think are still around. Also, as well, customer facing. Is there enough trust in an operator? Can it, does it have enough of a track record to say that it's okay? Others will say this is kind of on a need to know basis. In your experience, what seem to be the biggest doubts for customers when the operator conversation gets on the table?
Yeah, I think part of this goes back to your point about personas. I think that actually a lot of DBAs so let's start there, right? DBAs, they'll turn to an operator because they feel growing demand from either the platform team or developers or whoever it happens to be to provide the service that they're probably running on virtual machines or physical machines right now, which could be, a SQL, Cassandra, Elastic, whatever it happens to be. They want the same experience of consuming that service, that endpoint, but they want it in Kubernetes because that's where all the rest of the workloads are running. So you have this kind of initial demand on the DBA team to be able to do that. And I think the natural starting point, if you do any kind of research, is going to be an operator. So the DBA team in most cases will go off and play with an operator and test it out and get some proof of concept stuff running, and that's all great. The first area of concern that I come across is really questions around what's happening behind the scenes. So we understand that, yes, we can use a custom resource to define the deployment of a cluster and number of instances and all of that great stuff. But what if I want to go lower than that? What if I want to tune this database down to like a granular level, like I do at the moment in my on-prem VMware-based stack, whatever it happens to be? And a lot of those pieces are missing. And that's no fault of the operator creator, right? Because the point of an operator is to abstract away complexity and manage the lifecycle of the app. But then you will have those personas in the DBA team who want to be able to go to that low level, especially in enterprise use cases. So that's certainly part of the problem. I think someone who's maybe looking at this more holistically and strategically is going to be aware of briefings from vendors, whether it's platform vendors like you've got Rancher and Red Hat and all those guys building out these Kubernetes platforms, or from the database vendors who are briefing the analysts and saying, the future is the operator. In a lot of cases it is. But again, you take that into an enterprise environment and there are these challenges. So you've got this kind of high level persona, this maybe like a VP or a head of whatever, saying, why isn't this working? Operator is the answer, right? That's what I read in that report. That should solve all of our problems. Let's get an operator for every database. Here, I've got a quote. This is the answer, right? So that's the other piece of the puzzle. And then you've got the developers who are saying, well, I just want a cloud-like experience. I just want to click a button and get a database. Why do I have to know about anything else? I just want public cloud, but delivered to me on-prem, right? And so that's what, again, going back to my earlier point, that's what you're seeing, that tug of war where the DBA team feel like, well, we should be able to deliver this as a service because everything else in our stack is as a service, right? Platform as a service and so on. But we're not sure of the right way to do that. We're not confident we can do that. And then you've got pressure from the devs saying that's what we want. And then you've got pressure from leadership saying, but this should work because, this is the answer. I read it here. So it's a really difficult kind of dynamic, I think, between these different personas, trying to build out these new as a service models, but not necessarily having the tools or the confidence or the low level access to the actual workload to be able to do that in a way that's actually suitable for the business, right? That's production ready.
I think these challenges are a good reflection of why the community is going to continue to be very vibrant because of the things that are being navigated in a case-by-case basis. And like you said, with the the development, the evolution of these roles in terms of how they're growing, understanding whose responsibility it is. Like I said, those organizational challenges too. These are the things that make it quite interesting and very dynamic because of not just having a technical part, but a very human aspect as well in terms of how these things will be managed. We're entering, or we are in an economic situation where conversations about cost optimization, revenue, this is something that did come up in the report. But what's your take on that? And what are some things that we can extract from that? And also at an organizational level, what are the financial benefits or not of running stateful workloads on Kubernetes?
Yeah, that is the key question, right? I think there's already a very good understanding in the community that containerization can drive massive efficiencies, right? You can run more workloads on fewer machines. There's always that argument around cost takeout. And then the other side of that coin is probably, well, maybe we can shift to less of a CapEx model and more of an OpEx model, which has various accounting benefits and cash flow benefits that, you can listen to any cloud podcast to go into that detail, right? I don't need to repeat it. But I think there are a few other kind of emerging things to consider here. And if I think back to kind of the early days of Portworx, a lot of the conversations we had were almost like a religious argument around whether you should run databases on Kubernetes. That isn't there anymore. So there's definitely this understanding that is the right thing to do. But I think we still need to do a better job of talking about the benefits of doing that from a business perspective. And where I would start with that is to say, well, why are you running Kubernetes? Like, what was the original business case within your organization, global bank, telco, whatever you happen to be, to make that investment? Because it is an investment, even if you're not running an enterprise version, you still need to invest in skills, right? So to make that investment, what was the driver? And often it will be the same things we've been touching on with containers. So density, greater agility means we're going to market quicker, increasingly energy savings, again, fewer machines, reduces your energy requirements. But we're also seeing customers start to say, well, maybe we can take out some of these other layers of abstraction in our infrastructure. Like maybe we don't need our private cloud for infrastructure as a service. And maybe we don't need OpenStack or something else, or VMware, whatever it happens to be. Now, how does this relate to databases? I'm getting to that point. I think if you can say, well, what was the original business case? In most cases, it will be, we want to save X amount in this many years by containerizing 30% of our apps. And I think the next question from that is, well, why only 30%? A lot of customers will say, oh, well, we're not sure about data services, or we don't have the right storage solution, which is obviously where we come in, or we don't have a way of managing it, which is where an operator might come in. So it's those kind of issues which are basically restricting the scale of that potential business value. So I think if we as a community can help educate customers, or not just customers, but users, right, and say, well, hold on, here are 4 or 5 great ways of doing disaster recovery, and here are 4 or 5 great ways of managing data. How many more apps could you containerize? 80%? Well, what does that do to your business case? Because you're telling me you're going to save 20 million with 30%. What can you do with 80%? And that's massively compelling, right? But I think the key thing is we have to always relate it back to that primary reason for Kubernetes. We shouldn't look at data on Kubernetes as a standalone value proposition. We should look at it as really supersizing, do you want to go large with your fries, right? It's supersizing the original Kubernetes business case by just making it possible to bring more apps into the platform.
Very good. And as rightfully you explained, supersizing it, thinking with that day 2 mindset, like, all right, we've got in here. What else can we do? It's like, well, you have these options. And like you said, from 30 to 80%, the potential that's given there. In terms of things that were not in the report or things that you would like to see a little bit more coverage on from a Kubernetes, from a data on Kubernetes perspective, what are things that we could be talking about more as a community?
Yeah, so I think integration comes up a lot. How do we actually get all these different services integrated and managed in the same way? And that kind of goes back to the points we were touching on around operators and how they're all slightly different actually in how you manage them. So I think there's an area that would be quite interesting to dig deeper into. The other thing that I keep hearing about is KubeVirt. which is super exciting project. Basically, you manage virtual machines as Kubernetes objects, just like you run your pods, right? And for me, it's an infrastructure answer to an application and data question, right? But I think if we take a step back and look at the opportunity there, it kind of goes back to the business case question that you just asked me. The reality is that there are going to be workloads that are performance sensitive, that maybe need to interact with GPUs. And if you can start to remove some of those layers of abstraction and maybe have a mixed cluster where you've got physical workers alongside virtual machines, and those physical machines maybe have local disk that's highly performant and GPUs and other differences, you can start to make a case to the business for bringing those more critical workloads that are performance sensitive, have that dependency on a GPU into the Kubernetes platform. And again, that then supersizes the original business case. So whilst I think Kubevert is almost a symptom of a more kind of fundamental change, I think that project's exciting. And what that means is that users are now thinking differently about what their infrastructure stack has to look like. And some of those traditional approaches that assumed you need an infrastructure as a service everywhere, I think it's starting to be broken down. And now we've almost gone full circle, right? We've gone from kind of, bare metal to virtualization to containers and back to bare metal again. But that does open up a number of opportunities for a whole new category of application to be brought into these platforms.
Good to hear. And like you said, with a very dynamic and constantly evolving ecosystem, being open, being aware, and I think that's where community really comes in, is that you have a wide range of different experiences, people that are working with different kinds of end users, dealing with these challenges. As we said with operators, there are so many different ones to figure out, the intricacies of learning each one. Oftentimes that's done by trial and error frustration, but also having people out there who can also say, this has been my experience, and so this is what I would recommend. In terms of, it's always nice to, as we're talking about, the technical and also the human parts. Now I like to get to my favorite section of our DoK Talks, is where we get to know you a little bit better, Joe. So what are things that perhaps people don't know? You are a technical director, but what else? In terms of hobbies, things like you do in your free time, stuff that might surprise folks out there that they don't know about you?
Yeah, good question. So, I don't know. I think I surprised a lot of people. I'm pretty covered in tattoos. People, I've got this clean cut exterior because I'm in a lot of meetings, right? But I've got this kind of t-shirt shaped set of tattoos where as long as I'm wearing a shirt or a t-shirt, you can't see them, right? And they're quite geeky. I've got things like my kids' birth dates in binary down my side, and like GPS coordinates where I met my wife, and a few things like that. So I'm a little bit of I guess geeky guy there, and like surprising people when they see that. I'm also really as I've got, this is quite cliche, but as I've gotten older, I've sort of found this weird affinity for like countryside pursuits. So I moved outside. We used to live in cities when we were younger, my wife and I and our family, and we've moved out. We now live in a small village in Surrey, right? So we're down in the sticks, and I've started doing things like riding horses and going like play pigeon shooting and things like that. And I don't know why. Maybe I'm just getting older, but it's great fun. So maybe, I don't know, that's probably a bit of a surprising hobby, but it's good fun though. So it gets me out.
That's good. That's good. Do you have any tattoos related to the countryside now, or?
No, I'm not quite that deep into it. No, it's all. I'm still a geek. I've still got all the binary and stuff, but no, maybe that should be my next one. I don't know what it would be though. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the countryside, and the first thing that comes to mind, David Hockney's paintings of the countryside. I'm not saying you have to get an entire tattoo of that, but yeah, he has some really, really nice ones. And I remember seeing an exhibit about it around 10 years ago, and seeing it, he just goes out there with an iPad and creates these wonderful landscapes. And there is a lot to appreciate in the British countryside. So I think that's cool that you're out there and riding horses and shooting clay pigeons.
Not at the same time.
Right. Yeah, no, not at the same time. That's for expert levels only. But no, that's good. Like I said, I think the more that we get to know each other in this sense, as a community, the better. I have to say as well is that a lot of people were surprised that I didn't have tattoos, but this year actually I got two. And it was a good experience. And I'm glad that I didn't do it when I was younger, because I don't think my decisions would have been as good as they are now in terms of things that I would really like to represent. But yeah, I do recommend it as an experience for folks that out there that are a little. It doesn't hurt as much as people say. Or I was a little bit kind of surprised that pleasantly.
What did you get, Bob?
That's a good
what
question. So I got two different things, but both are family related. So for me, like, my family is a very, very important part of my life, and also because, like, living far away, it's another way to keep them closer. So I have one is it's a silhouette from a photograph of my grandfather when he met Johnny Cash in the 1980s, which is a long story behind how that happened, but basically something that shouldn't have happened but ended up happening for different reasons. So I have something related to that, and then I have another one, which is it's a symbol. It's a bit long to explain, but it's basically a hand holding a torch as a reminder of, like, to do the right thing, and to be the one of the people carrying the fire, in the sense of trying to, like I said, trying to do the right thing. Longer explanation. Perhaps we can get into that into a side episode. But and it's difficult to compete with GPS coordinates and dates written in binary. I don't think I can keep up with that.
Wow. You're right about waiting. My first tattoo when I was a student is a Star Wars Rebel Alliance symbol on my arm, which, is kind of cool, but is it that meaningful? No. And I got that years and years and years ago. So you definitely did the right thing waiting, that's for sure.
Yeah, that was the hardest thing for me about it, was taking that first step of not knowing, am I really going to like this? Am I going to get tired of it? Is it something that's really going to make sense for me? And so, so it took a while, but it was worth the wait. I think all of it's just about sort of the meaning that you put on it and what it means to you. Whatever it means to somebody else, like, that's kind of up to them. But I think that if you have sort of an investment in it, emotionally, or that it represents something important, or just that you think it's fun, it's really up to everyone to decide what works best for them. So yeah, good. Well, this was a lovely conversation. If folks want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do
it? Twitter is good, although maybe not these days if it's still here in a couple of months. But so I'm it's my surname without any vowels on Twitter, so GRDNR. And or you can just email me at my email address, which is jgardiner@purestorage.com.
That works. Perfect. Joe, very nice having with us today. Sorry. And look forward to future conversations. I think there's a lot to be unpacked here. And that's what's, like I said, what's so exciting about the things that we're talking about in the community. So we definitely need to take a deeper dive on KubeVirt for sure. And you can bet that we'll be bringing you in for your opinion on that.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Bart.
All right. Take care. Cheers.